Hello, everybody. Brady here, joined again for another SitRep with Colonel Towner-Watkins. How are you today?
Great. How are you?
Good. One of the things we always talk about is, we started out, first time I ever talked was about Operation Gladio, and you've been all over the internet spreading the good word on that, and doing a couple shows with me as well. And we've got a couple of situations going on today in other parts of the world, and I've referred to Belarus and the country of Georgia, which are just wonderful examples of what we've been talking about. So I thought what I'd do for people who have not seen us do the show together, have not heard you before, if you give kind of an overview of what Operation Gladio is and what the color revolutions, and I do air quotes on that, and what they're all about. What are the characteristics that we've seen time after time after time when the U.S. implements regime change all over the world? So I turn that over to you.
Okay, so in a nutshell, Operation Gladio was an effort post-World War II to continue a tactic that's called stay behind unit strategy of tension. It goes by many different names. It's been known as Operation Gladio, Operation Condor, depending on where you're at geographically. It goes by different names, but it is a tactic of using basically paramilitary forces as a bludgeon to accomplish strategic goals. And in the case of regime change, the strategic goals are affected on behalf of what I label an international syndicate. There's this body of people that basically have been going around the world and capturing resources, whether it's businesses, mining, water rights, territory in general through UNESCO. There has been an all-out effort by this entity to acquire power. And they use these paramilitary forces that I generically label Gladio to do it. And they did it prior to World War II, as you're well aware of, in places like Nicaragua, through the use of international law firms like Cromwell and Sullivan and Cromwell.
My favorites.
But it left them at risk. So you have civilians, and they used a lot of the U.S. Marines, unbeknownst to them, in this capacity, which was illegal. And in order to kind of wrap this paramilitary capability into a government, they put it primarily in Western governments under the form of NATO and their intelligence services, whether it was MI6, BND in Germany, or the CIA after World War II. And so now you not only have the authority of a governmental entity, you also have this rubber stamp called national security, that anything that you do in the form of regime change in order to steal resources or gain more power can be classified, coveted away, and completely absent any legal remedy of the people that are being overtaken. So it's kind of like the perfect crime, if you will. And I have alleged that, to me, in looking in hindsight with the creation of the map after World War II and the creation of this paramilitary force, there were fault lines on purpose created via maps and nation states that allowed for a pickup of a phone and say, hey, we're going to destabilize this particular area with this particular Gladio capability, and then we're going to go in and do whatever it is we want, whether it's grow opium, steal gold, steal diamonds, whatever. And it's just like war on demand using these paramilitary forces. And if you go back and you start tracking, over 75 governments have been destabilized, if not couped. And so I think it's like a reptilian. They keep changing shapes. They have just simply started labeling this same apparatus as color revolutions to get ignorant people of history to say, oh, this is a new phenomenon. Because as you articulated, this only, if you search Google, whatever you want to do on color revolutions, it seems like a phenomenon that started in the 2000s.
Yeah,
But if
2000,
you do that same
2003.
search on coups, you see that it goes back to the late 1800s, if not before that.
So yeah, I've been using the word the number 74 coups or to color revolutions. I'll go with 75, and today we'll talk about what may be happening in number 76 and 77 as we speak. You used an interesting term. You talked about the fault lines, and they were constructed fault lines.
Correct.
The British did this post World War One. The NATO countries did this post World War Two. But what they really are doing with these fault lines is, and they're creating an artificial country where you're going to have parts of the population that do not share the same ethnic
Correct.
background, sometimes not the same religion. So it's much easier to spark a fire when you already have
Correct.
the kindling in place, and that was done
Yes.
on purpose.
And
So
you have the creation post World War II. In addition to the CIA, you had things like it started off as AID, then it became USAID, and then you had NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. You have all of these NGOs. You see the CIA initially being the pointy end of the spear in doing all of this. They have almost receded. They've not gone away. They're still pulling the strings, but they've receded to the background and put in front of them this buffering capability called NGOs. All of these NGOs are still controlled by the intelligence community.
yeah,
And
no,
we need to
yeah, and
understand.
it's directly by the U.S. State Department. When the U.S. State Department opens up an embassy, the NGOs follow. And when you talk about the State Department, it's just one half of the same coin that is U.S. foreign policy. The other half being the intelligence agencies. The State
Correct.
Department, the diplomatic, the other is the covert and military side of it. And it's no coincidence that when the CIA became the CIA, Alan Dulles was the head of the CIA, and his brother John Foster Dulles was running the State Department, and the two have been working just like that ever since. So
Set up to run just like that. And just let me put one other stamp on that. Wisner, who ran the Office of Policy Coordination in the State Department prior to the end of World War II, moves over and runs the Office of Policy Coordination in the CIA post creation of the CIA, because as I have repeatedly said, the CIA didn't do anything new. It just created a safety umbrella for everything that had already been going on. And Frank Wisner took his, they call it the Office of Dirty Tricks, out of the State Department, lock, stock, and barrel, all of the people, and just moved it over to the CIA. That's how intricately they're wrapped together.
Yeah, and these tactics are very similar to what in the age of the British Empire, what they would do to their colonies all over the world. You destabilize, you connect with dissidents that are local, people that are willing to sell out their existing government, whether it be for money or for ideology, and you
Right.
use that so you can exploit the resources. Real quick before we jump into the new modern examples or the current ones, we wanted to talk a little bit about what are some of the characteristics of these coups. What do we see each time? You'll see the presence of the State Department. You'll see the NGOs come on board with lots of foreign money coming in. You will see student protests, and it always seems like it's right around an election that the Western world will then challenge that election, protest in the street, hopefully get it just enough violence so there's global outrage and pressure the existing or the winning regime to resign. And they give the appearance, the way the media will blow up these protests, you'll think that this is a massive populist uprising, and the numbers just don't match that out. You basically give the heckler's veto to maybe 10 or 20,000 people in a country with millions. We saw that play out in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter riots,
Right.
which could definitely be considered a color revolution, but we'll get into that another time. But you see a city of 2 million people, and 2,000 people would go, show up downtown and start burning and spray painting and breaking in. And with the media coverage, they made it seem like it's a popular uprising, but it was less than 1/10 of the population of that city that was in the streets. And yet it changes the whole culture because of the media coverage. So, and you get these characteristics time after time after time.
One of the other things that I would also point out in, obviously you're talking escalation. They will have forces, paramilitary forces on standby as these become ramped up. And the paramilitary forces are trained generally in nearby countries in the form of, going back again in Nicaragua, you had them being trained in Costa Rica and Honduras. And so you will find, and the recent attack on Russia, they were trained in Ukraine and Turkey, both in those general areas. To Erdogan's credit, he bombed he got cell phone data from Russia intelligence, and where they were collaborating in Turkey, he actually bombed their training facilities. So good on him for taking some positive action. But that is like the last step, is to then send in the paramilitary capability. They will, as you just articulated, in the escalation with people in the streets, as you saw at Indiana University, they had snipers on the top of the buildings there. That's the last step for them to actually effect a violent action that then kind of pushes things over the edge for them to demand regime change. And so that's kind of the life cycle of these coups.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because we're going to see that same characteristic in both Belarus and Georgia. The exact same things are happening.
Exactly.
So let's jump into it and where we got started. Well, it was about a week ago today. I was just browsing Telegram, and I saw something very interesting, and I texted it over to you when we got a chance to talk about this a little bit. And this is just a little blurb. I don't even know the official channel where it came from, but it says the head of the KGB of Belarus, they still call it the KGB to this day, said that an attempt to attack Minsk with drones from the territory of Lithuania was prevented. Lukashenko said that the NATO has plans to seize the Kobrin region of Belarus with the help of trained militants who should capture Kobrin, proclaim Zamagar power. Zamagar is a group, ethnic group, power there, and call in NATO troops there, exactly as you just described.
Correct.
Said the militants are undergoing training on the territory of Ukraine and NATO countries. They are trying to create terrorist cells inside Belarus.
Just like I said.
It's, they aren't very creative with their playbook. It's a lot of rinse, wash, repeat. There are no plans to carry out mobilization of the territory of Belarus yet. And they said the other point they made was dozens of Russian nuclear warheads have already been deployed in Belarus. The missiles were supplied at Lukashenko's personal request. I thought that was, I brought that to your attention because we talk about these characteristics of color revolution, and you read a headline like that and you say, okay, what's NATO want in Belarus? And it's pretty clear because they are relatively allied with the Russians. But I'd like to, well, let's do a little bit of background of Belarus, and then we can talk, because it's interesting, and I think it'll tell a lot of stories. First of all, where is Belarus? Let me grab the map here.
And while you're doing that, I did want to point out that there is another article that was in Winnipeg, of all places, that talked about those attacks. And I wanted to make clear something that I've noticed about this. What they said when they were discussing the attacks is Lithuania said unequivocally, our army is not involved in an attack on Belarus. However, Lithuania has a stay-behind capability, and it's called something like long rifles, and they are, in fact, part of the initiative to do that. And that's how they get around this. They parse words. They both things can be true. The Lithuanian actual army cannot be involved in it, but that doesn't mean Lithuanian government is not involved in it. And I just want people to start paying attention to the way they word their comments. So go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great point. So this here is a recent map of Belarus, and you can see they're surrounded, they're landlocked. They're surrounded by Ukraine on the south, Poland and Lithuania to the west, Latvia up north, and then of course they've got a large border with Russia, who they are closely aligned with or allied with, but that's not always been as smooth um, as the Western media might make you appear to be. Um, this part of the world has seen, it's one of the, first of all, Belarus is one of the it was settled a very long time ago. They're one of the very earliest civilizations to mine gold. So it is an ancient peoples, but it's been ruled over by, well, let's see. They've been ruled over in the last 1,500 years. It used to be just a Slavic duchy. It was never really an independent country. It was more of a duchy. They got ceded to Kiev in Ukraine in around 960 AD and went all the way through the Middle Ages as not being all that significant. But over the next 1,000 years, they were ruled by Lithuania, Poland, Russia, the Habsburg Empire, Prussia, the Soviet Union, and the Nazis. So they've been through quite a bit, and there's been a lot of, you're going to get some ethnic mixing with that kind of situation. So you do have different tribes in Belarus. They got their independence from the Soviets in '91, and they maintain really close ties. The president there is Lukashenko, and he has been the president there, I believe, since 1994. So almost the entire.
Right.
And he's a strongman dictator type. He just, they have elections. The people in the West question every single one of those elections, the legitimacy of it. The most recent one he won with apparently 80% of the vote, but we'll get into that a little bit more. They had a really interesting treaty with the Russians starting in 1999, where they were basically they were joined Russia as what's called a union state. Citizens of Russia and Belarus can go back and forth without passports. They can live in either country, work in either country, but they are independent countries. Russia's always wanted to tighten the relationship, and um, Lukashenko I'm sorry, Lukashenko has been resisting for about a decade, and that's where the story gets kind of interesting. Anything to add in there on the history before we jump in?
No, that about does it.
Okay, so in 2019, what's called the Sochi summit, Lukashenko and Putin had a bunch of meetings, and during that, Putin was pushing for a full union. The way Russia had really kept them as a vassal state is Russia had always given Belarus discounted oil and gas, which Belarus could then sell to other countries, and that was a big part of their economy. Well, when Lukashenko pushed back against Putin in 2019, Russia pulls the gas treaty away, and Belarus has to go out and find oil from other countries. They turn to the West. It might have been a mistake. They bought oil from, I want to say, doesn't matter where from, some from the United States, was interesting. And we opened up diplomatic relations. The United States opens up diplomatic relations with Belarus. And with diplomatic relations, we get an embassy. And with an embassy, color revolutions sometimes follow. In 2020, the year of COVID, the National Endowment for Democracy financed 34 projects and organizations in Belarus itself. So from 0 to 34. This is all done with foreign money. Lukashenko's under fire because of his response to COVID, because he basically did very little at the time. So that's more Western political pressure is being put on him. They had elections coming up in 2020. No coincidence. This fits into our same theme. That election was scheduled for August 4th, 2020. And something happens on July 29th. And the story that hit the press everywhere was that 200 Russian mercenaries came from Russia to infiltrate Belarus to disrupt the elections. They detained 32 Russian fighters who were described as Wagner employees. Wagner, of course, is the private military organization in Russia. It gets interesting because this tip came from the Ukrainian SBU intelligence. Well, we found out later, it turns out these men, they were hired to be security for Russian oil giant Rosneft, and they were supposed to be going to Syria and Venezuela. And they said, okay, come to Belarus. We're going to book you flights to these end destinations and pay you a lot of money. These are former mercenaries that did work for Wagner. Those tickets were booked by a travel agency in Kiev, and that travel agency was formed for one purpose. That's the only travel they ever booked. So these mercenaries traveled to Belarus. They're told their flight from Turkey, which is where they're going to fly out of, got canceled. So they had to sit there and wait in a hotel for a few days for a new flight. And then,
Turkey?
well, that's where they're supposed to fly out of Turkey. That's what the article says. What gets funny is this basically orders all came from Ukraine to tell these
Yeah.
mercenaries to go sit there in Belarus in a hotel, and then they tip off the Belarus KGB, said, hey, you got these Russians in there, and they go and arrest it.
But doesn't that sound exactly what I was just talking about the attack on Russia? They originate in Turkey because Turkey, most people don't realize, within NATO, Turkey has the second largest military, all trained by the US. And they had the single largest Operation Gladio program, bar none, in the entire world. They were called Gray Wolves.
Yes.
And they do a lot of the training. So I'm not surprised that their travel begins in Turkey.
The similarities never stop. Everything rhymes for a reason. So we jump into this 2020 election, and Lukashenko is, he's managed to jail two of his biggest political rivals, including the husband of a woman named Svetlana. I'm going to butcher this name. Tsikhanouskaya. We'll call her Svetlana for today's purposes. Her husband gets jailed, and she basically is unable to register him to run, so she runs herself, gets her 100,000 signatures, and the West pushed her. They started having demonstrations in the streets, anti-regime student demonstrations. Well, the election comes, and Lukashenko wins with over 80% of the vote. People can question the legitimacy of anybody being that popular. Long story short, she goes into exile immediately thereafter and is running a shadow government from Lithuania. The last little data point before I get your commentary on this is, of course, it was Belarus that interceded with Putin and the Wagner rebellion when Prigozhin was marching on Moscow. So Belarus was involved in that. And apparently that sort of the ties between Belarus and Russia, Putin and Lukashenko, are closer now as a result of that. I'll turn this over to you because, I just laid out the facts. So you're going to have some good color commentary on everything we're seeing.
Well, and I almost, when I look at this stuff from the 30,000 foot look, obviously Putin knows about Operation Gladio. He knows what their tactics are. And I would not at all be surprised if any element of the disenfranchisement, because keep in mind, you're talking 2019. This is Trump's in the White House. What if this falling out between, and this is completely hypothetical, what if the falling out between Russia and Belarus is in order to map exactly what happened, USAID, NED, the Samantha Powers, all of the people coming in and actually doing what they've done all over the world repeatedly. Only this time, every single thing is being tracked. And you watch everything that you just laid out, because you can do this exact thing in every country. And I'm obviously in the process of describing that on most of my podcast. And so I find it interesting as you're laying that out. It is a replication of everything. But at the same time, we have somebody who is completely different in the White House as it's all unfolding, that isn't getting his intel from the CIA. And that, of course, was one of the biggest complaints that they being the international syndicate had of Trump, is he received independent intel absent the IC and their standard talking points. So it is very real possibility that Trump was getting the real information during what you just laid out, instead of the sanitized version that basically says Belarus is bad, NATO's all good. And I also found very interesting, you just articulated the other point that I had made of how they set up training camps on the borders. You just articulated they were in Lithuania and Ukraine. And we already have documentation via the New York Times that there are underground CIA, what I call Operation Gladio units, distributed along the boundary of Russia and Ukraine. So it was all set up, and that started in 2014 by their own admission.
Yep. Yeah, so Belarus is going to, it's in play. We're sitting in a period of time where Russia is very close to, looks to be about to achieve a pretty decisive victory of Ukraine. Ukraine's defenses are crumbling very quickly. Doesn't matter how many arms the United States gives to Ukraine, they are running out of actual Ukrainians to, carry those weapons, which is why they're trying to conscript Ukrainians from all over the world in these great democracies. The last point I'll bring up about the opposition in Belarus is they are very much pro-Western, anti-Russian, and Svetlana herself has been making the rounds and all the diplomatic circles, pounding the table to give support to Ukraine in a war with Russia. Victory for Ukraine is a victory for Belarus, is one of her sayings. That's not going to happen, but doesn't mean that the Western powers, the NATO, is not going to keep trying to meddle into Belarus. It looks like Lukashenko has got a very firm grip on power, so I'm not sure how successful it's going to be, but doesn't mean they're not going to try or haven't been trying.
So I did want to mention a couple of things. This is a quote. Let's see, hold on just a second. Because it addresses, let's see. I'm finding it. Speaking during a meeting with officials Monday, Lukashenko said the country needs to form its own paramilitary units in every town or village to serve as territorial defense to complement the country's 45,000 military in case of aggression. He added that every Belarus man must learn how to handle weapons to protect his family and home if needed. And that was in that Winnipeg article, which I think is obviously ironic, because this was in February 2023, because he's talking about setting up Gladio units in Belarus for defense of their own home territory. So to me, it's almost like sticking an eye in NATO's, or sticking a finger in NATO's eye, saying, we know what you do, and I'm going to put this announcement out to the world that we're going to be doing it too. So come on in. We're going to have our Gladio units waiting for you.
Yeah, and the word is out of what they do, not just because of your efforts, but there's a lot of authors out there, and these other countries they're not stupid. They can see what happens with their own eyes, and they've watched all the regime changes carried out by the West for quite some, for decades, and they are learning how to stop them, because they aren't all successful. And I think that's
I also found an article that talked about the freezing of assets of what the West calls mercenaries in the Wagner group. And it said the UK government on Thursday imposed an asset freeze and travel ban on 13 Wagner mercenaries over alleged attacks on civilians and other human rights abuses in Africa. And I had to chuckle. You're what? This is the UK government in the US, who's affected these 75 plus coups around the world, are talking about freezing assets of paramilitary forces when they've unleashed their own trained paramilitary forces on these countries and killed millions of people around the world. They want to freeze those assets? Are you
Yeah,
kidding me?
you see, it's different because we do it. It's in the name of democracy, and when they do it, it's obviously not. It's in the that's the hypocrisy, and yeah, that's why that's why you see democracy shoved down our throats. They can do just about anything in the name of democracy. We will go to war in the name of democracy. Ukraine was sold to us. We have to save democracy, and that's what they use, and that's how they justify the tactics. The ends justify the means in this particular case. Um, I've got a little. If we have time for it, I've got a couple of economic issues on the Russia sanctions, but hopefully we can get to it. And I'll
Okay.
circle back to what you just said. Uh, let's take a look at Georgia. First thing, what's going on in Georgia right now? Well, they're trying to pass a law. I'll tell you exactly what it's called. I've got it here in my notes. Give me 1 second. They're trying to, it's called a law on the transparency of foreign influence, is what they're trying to pass. And apparently, the people are in the streets protesting it, calling it a Russian law. Well, we'll get into that in a little bit, but I just wanted to show you what these protests look like today. This is from 48 hours ago. This is what a color revolution looks like on the ground. And shoot, do I have to make sure you can tell me if you can hear the volume? Just a thumbs up. But no volume?
No volume.
I always forget to do that when we're on Zoom. Share screen again. Share sound.
Yeah, I can hear.
So if we compare, just to compare that, the level of violence we're seeing, that's gunfire. So there is real violence, and they are cracking down in Georgia. I guess we ought to probably talk about where is Georgia and why is it important. Georgia sits on the eastern edge of the Black Sea, surrounded by Russia on the north, Azerbaijan and Armenia and Turkey to the south. It is this whole region is governed, surrounded to the north by the northern upper Caucasoid Mountains, and in the south. So it is surrounded by two mountain ranges in the north and the south, and the Black Sea to the west. It has been a very strategic location for a long time. Settled by a tribe called the Kartvelians, is known as the Land of the Wolf. It was not named after Prince George or St. George, as some people say. This also was known for a long time on maps as Iberia. These different areas have been under many different flags over the last 2,000 years. They've lived under the rule of Rome, Armenia, Persia, Parthia, the Eastern Roman Empire. They were raided by the Khazarians, the nobles, the nomads to the north. The Arab Empire ruled over it. They were invaded by the Mongols. They were ruled by the Ottoman Turks. They became incorporated into Russia and then the USSR. It became the Kingdom of Georgia, which encompasses basically is the territories you see on the map right there, right around 1008. Fast forward to the 20th century, they got their independence post-Soviet in 1991, had a civil war in 93. The Georgian people have been basically Christian for the last 1,500 years, but with all that intermixing with the Armenians and the Arab empires, you do have some Muslims in the population. You really do have three basic ethnic groups making up what is now known as Georgia. So you've got that recipe for unrest, the different nationalities or ethnicities, I should say, is better. So in 1993, they have a civil war, kind of settles down, and what's been a relatively stable government since then. They were one of the very first of the color revolutions. In 2003, what happened in Georgia elections, the parliamentary elections, was called the Rose Revolution. The the political faction that the West favored lost. The elections are disputed, followed by 20 days of violent protest, led by a strong role of national of NGOs and student activism. That's straight out of the articles. Same thing over and over again, and that's basically how Georgia. Well, this new party was led by a gentleman by the name of Mikhail Saakashvili. I'm so bad with these names. Saakashvili. He became
Hashvili.
yeah. So the way in Georgia, the way it works is you have the parliamentary elections every 4 years in the odd year. So it'd be 2003. The following year, you have the presidential election. And so the party that won the Rose Revolution in 2003, they put in their president, Mikhail Saakashvili. You say it. I just can't speak the language. He becomes the president in 2004 and is reelected in 2008. 2008 is a big deal because you had what was called the Russo-Georgian War. Basically, Russia was backing separatists in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And you can see on this map, those two are separated out from Georgia. It's a different color. What happened after 5 days of fighting, Georgia lost both territories. Russia took them over and let them become independent states. That was the famous invasion from Russia of Georgia, which, like, it took 5 days. France intervened, negotiated a peace, and it wasn't all that bloody. There were mass demonstrations in 2007 and then 2011. Saakashvili had to put those down. This is not a very politically popular party, and they ended up losing elections in 2012, the parliamentary. He was unable to run again in 2013. He was termed out. And so he leaves. Interesting side note, he leaves and moves to Ukraine in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
In 2013, he was a huge supporter of the Maidan Revolution, which
Yep.
in 2014, and he was basically was named as a reward. He became named governor of the Odessa Oblast, which, if you're following the Ukraine war, is kind of a big deal.
Yes.
He would end up leaving that position in 2016. He's had Georgian prosecutors have filed charges against him all the way back to 2014, and he did get jailed in 2021 and is serving 6 years in Georgia right now. Little side note on that. You knew the name, so you want to give me more background on him from his Ukraine experience?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I do want to point out that for our talking points, when Senator Lugar created the Level 4 bioweapon lab program in former Soviet countries, there are 2 Level 4 named after him with his name on the outside of the building. One is in Ukraine and one is in Georgia. And that's not a coincidence.
You give me 1 second. I'm going to pause the recording for a second, and I've got to take care of some noise in the background. So we'll resume in 1 second. And we're back. So going into what's happening today in Georgia, which we just talked about, it's, once again, we're going to see the same characteristics over and over. The reason Georgia is trying to pass a law on the transparency of foreign influence is because it has become a big problem. There are over 20,000 NGOs active in Georgia today. And to put that into perspective, that is one NGO for every 148 citizens in the country. 90% of that funding comes from foreign countries. And that's why, and Georgia's trying to, basically their ruling party is trying to get these foreign intervention out of their country. And it's being criticized by the United States and other Western nations. But we've got, we've got the FARA Act ourselves. And it's basically, if you're a foreign government doing, or a foreign entity doing business in your country, it's got to be transparent. That's all they're trying to do. Yet the students there that are protesting are saying, oh, it's a pro-Russian bill. And, maybe it is helpful to Russia, but because it's harmful to NATO.
Well, but stop just a second and think about what you just said. It's pro-Russian. But doesn't that mean by default that it's Western NGOs that are there buying influence?
Yeah,
Because you can't have it both ways. If it's more supportive, because otherwise it would be pro-Western, right? If it wasn't Western NGOs there, I
yeah,
mean, they're acknowledging the fact that it is us there trying to take over Georgia, and that actually limiting our influence in Georgia is supportive of Russia. Okay, it's pro-Russia because all of the Western people have got their people in there trying to take over another satellite along the border of Russia to hem them in.
yeah, and that's been the ongoing. In fact, I should pull this map up right now because you just queued it up really nicely for it. This is a pretty map of the Black Sea. And over here on the eastern shore, we've got Georgia. Turkey, very strategically, this is has a southern shore. Right here at Istanbul is basically the gateway to the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean. So
Yeah,
this an awful lot of trade comes through here. What's going on in Ukraine is Crimea. This is all owned by you go from Georgia, a little bit of Russian territory. You've got Crimea. If this Odessa region falls to Russia, Ukraine becomes landlocked and
correct.
basically a shell of a country with a huge demographic problem, um, because everybody under the age of 25 is pretty much gone or dead. I mean, they already had a declining birth rate.
And
So
since you have this up, I also want to point out Moldova over here. They have another territory that's like Trachonesis. I don't know the exact pronunciation of it. That the West is also, it's all ethnic Russian. It basically fits all of the exact same criteria as the Donbass region, and they're going through all of the same issues there. So this is a strategic, all along the border here, offensive against Russia and the destabilization. While we're talking about Georgia and Belarus today, this is all under the auspices of destabilizing Russia at the 30,000-foot look. So go ahead.
yeah, and it's going to be very interesting strategically if Russia does take Odessa and adds Moldova. These are all ethnically Russian peoples. You would have one contiguous, line of Russia or Russian satellite states. The issue here is not that is the narrative being painted by the NATO countries is that the reason Russia invaded Ukraine is they're going to keep taking back all these NATO countries, and that's pretty clear that that's not Putin's intent. It's more to protect the Russian speaking and reunite Russia. That I don't think they have any ability or aspirations to say take on Poland or anything like that.
No.
But this Black Sea territory, to have just half the coast all be under one united, not united, but one flag, that strategically, you can see why NATO would want to pierce a hole in that. So Georgia is going to be something that is in play all year,
Yep.
longer. So I wanted to read an interesting quote for you to close out on Georgia. They recently rejected a U.S. invitation to discuss partnership and assistance, which is good. Well, if you're on the side of Georgia having their own independence, which I am, I think
Yes, exactly.
let's just make it clear. I am, I love America. I'm an American patriot. I love where I come from. I'm not always crazy about our government policies, which is why we're very critical of them. But I think people around the world have the right to their own, sovereignty. And
Absolutely. And that's all we want. Bring our military home, allow other people to settle their own issues. They do not need our help.
no, nor do they need all, nor do they need all of our weapons. And that's part of a problem. If you can get the major weapons manufacturing countries to knock it off and quit exporting stuff, the world would be a much more peaceful place.
Yep.
So I just wanted to read this quote. The Georgia's prime minister is a guy by the name of Kobakidze. I think I even said that one right. And well, here's a quote of what he said to the U.S. State Department counselor, a guy by the name of Derek Chollet. I spoke to Counselor Department of State, and expressed my sincere disappointment with the two revolution attempts of 2020 and 2023, supported by former U.S. ambassador and those carried out through NGOs financed from external sources. Had these attempts been successful, the second front line would have opened in Georgia. So he's calling out the U.S. ambassador on two previous color revolutions in his country just in the last 3 or 4 years. Besides, I explained to Mr. Chollet that false statements made by the officials of the U.S. State Department about the transparency bill and street rallies remind us of similar false statements made by the former U.S. ambassador in 2020 and 2023, which served to the facilitation of violence from foreign-funded actors and to the support of revolutionary processes back then. Sounding familiar?
Yes. Yes.
Also, I clarified to Mr. Chollet that it requires a special effort to restart the relations against this background, which is impossible without a fair and honest approach. And lastly, he ended it with a dig. I have not expressed my concerns with Mr. Chollet about a brutal crackdown of the students' protest rally in New York City.
Ouch.
Yeah, a little pot calling the kettle black there, huh?
So here's another thing just for the researchers that are watching this. I highly recommend you go look, as you articulated, that they will have with the engagement from the US have gotten an ambassador. One of the things that we track in our study of Gladio operations around the world is whoever the senior, because with the State Department embassy or consulate comes CIA. I'm going to argue in most cases they're one and the same. And the presence of the ambassadors and the senior station chiefs of the CIA all seem to have common presence, because it's not all of them. And I want everybody to understand that. Not all of our ambassadors even know this crap goes on. There is an elite group within the State Department of an ambassador corps that all throughout decades and decades, it just goes on and on, that they show up in all of the places while the coups are going on.
And that doesn't matter. We're not talking about, it doesn't matter if it's a Republican presidency or a
No,
Democrat. These
no.
are permanent bureaucracy.
This is a uniparty approach to foreign policy. It has nothing to do with parties. It has everything to do with the international syndicate that owns the politicians and the ambassadorships and blah, blah, blah. And so you have this core group of people that repeatedly show up in all of the right places at all the right times to make sure these revolutions go off. And you have the senior CIA station chief, who you keep seeing over and over and over again in all of the right places.
Yeah, and it's interesting about these NGOs. They ostensibly are, we're private organizations. Well, no, you're not. They get like a vast majority of their funding from the U.S. government, and a lot of it comes through the State Department. State Department is funding all these NGOs, so it's basically doing the dirty work of the U.S. government without the fingerprints being on it. But if you see from what's going on, and the quotes from Georgia and Belarus, the gig is up. Everyone's on to what the game plan is. They are now starting to try to get these NGOs out of their countries. I suspect you're going to start seeing a big movement of that coming out of South America, and I'm wondering if what's going on in Niger with the U.S. military being kicked out there, if that's part of the same trend.
Well, interestingly, the guy that the military colonel, I believe was his rank, that took over Niger in their coup, he was trained at Fort Benning's former School of Americas. He was one of our guys.
Okay.
And he overthrew the elected government there, and then basically decided to throw us out after we finished building $100 million drone base there. So yeah, $100 million. And just within the last few days, 1,000 Russian troops have arrived at that base where our U.S. military is located.
Yeah, and I was just reading that there's also French and Italian troops on that base, and they're all pretty well behaved and get along with the Russians. But apparently, people, what I read this morning was the American troops are very, shall we say, agitated.
Well, but we're brainwashed. And of course, I can confess I was one of them. Um, we have been brainwashed, we have been conditioned, whatever programmed, if you want to use that word, to hate Russian military because we have never been told the truth about our real history. And I can't, I could jump up and down and stomp my feet. It is only within the last few years of doing extensive research that I have realized just how overwhelming the educational process is internal to the military in programming us to respond like a Pavlov response dog. That you mention Russia, immediately you get enemy. And there is nothing further from the truth. There are so many nuances to all of that. And yet our military misses it all. And just to further illustrate that, I do know someone who was in the hierarchy of our military education system, like at the top of it, and had a conversation about just how, obviously for him after the fact as well, how devastating that is to the furtherance of our beneficial foreign policy, that most of the senior leadership of the military is unaware of the implications of what we've done around the world and how it's the impression that it leaves on other people.
Yeah, there was a book, I think it was written in the 60s called The Ugly American. I read it as a teenager, and that kind of really talked about American foreign policy, and a lot of it was the economic policy, how U.S. corporations were going in there and basically exploiting third world countries. But that planted the seed of all this in my mind at a very young age. So I've always been looking for it, and it's a book I've been meaning to reread for more than 20 years. I need to go out and find that one.
I think it would be beneficial within what we have recently learned to reread. I read it a long time ago as well, but I do think it would be much more beneficial now.
Yeah, let's make that a group project. One more map for you today, because we just talked about the geopolitics of the area, and of course this is nothing new. With Black Sea, this would have been the Mediterranean and the Black Sea up here. This is the Eastern Roman Empire, and of course the Western Roman Empire, which we most just call Rome. Right here would be Byzantium. This would be Turkey in here, but all of these areas have been contested all this time. And it's just as strategic today as it was then. So I thought that would be fun to share. You gave me a decent segue into a couple of economic issues. You talked about the Russian sanctions. And
So can I just put one more thing out there? I do want to say that let me pull it up here. The ambassador to Georgia during the time period you were just talking about, 20 to 23, happened to be Robin Dunnigan. And she was also in Afghanistan while we were going through what I refer to as protection, poppy protection. So there is a little overlap there. And then apparently the senior station chief in Georgia was Ian Crawford Kelly. And he also was involved from 2010 to 2013 in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which you may or may not know. Yeah, exactly. So you see, I can tell from your face, when you start looking at these people's background, I mean, that's basically the senior CIA guy there. They won't say CIA, but that's what the station chief is. And so you start to see the overlap with these people. Go ahead.
well, no, I'll jump into that in a second here. I wanted to follow up on what you just said, because it's absolutely true. And this is the permanent bureaucracy. This is the definition of what is the deep state. It is the
Correct.
bureaucratic state. I like to call it the shadow state, which encompasses even more of that. they get their orders from these NGOs like the Atlantic Council, the Council of Foreign Relations. These are the people that, they're above politics. Yeah, they do care who sits in the Oval Office, but it really doesn't affect them too much because they control the levers of power in the bureaucracy. And you get this once you're on the inside that club, I don't think there's any getting out of it. We just saw the James O'Keefe tape released last week of the one of his undercover, um, I guess reporters is the right word, got some CIA contractor on tape saying, "Oh yeah, we held all this information back from Trump." Well, that's not a government of free people. You can't have an agency. These people hide behind things like national security. They always use, "Oh, national security, we can't tell you. It's on a need-to-know basis." So there's no oversight at all from Congress. You don't live in a free society if your government has that many secrets. It is a
And the
problem.
one, right, and what's the figure that Tucker says, 10 billion pieces of paper that are still classified in Suitland Park, on off of Suitland Parkway in Maryland, in underground vaults. Is like the same as 3 football fields long, in like 15-foot filing cabinets. You are not a free society when your government has classified that much information from you. You don't know what they're doing, and you don't know what they're doing in your name. Yeah, so that, to me, this is all representative of that international syndicate that I'm prone to talk about ad nauseum, and their control over how things unfold.
Yeah, it's amazing. Both you and I have traveled pretty extensively to other countries. And it's funny that Americans are treated very warmly. People like us as individuals. They're not, I guess, as the years have gone by and more people I talk to in foreign countries, the more they realize, what our foreign policy has actually done to the rest of the world. And, which is great because I think it takes awareness to stop, it takes a universal awareness to really stop this and reverse it.
What most people that I encounter overseas, they can't believe we're so stupid that we don't know what our government's doing. That's their big kind of disconnect. They love us as people. Like, I was warmly embraced when I lived in Italy. When I traveled throughout Europe, never did I have a ugly American experience ever. But I did. I have been approached in different places with, "Why don't y'all know what your government's doing?" Because they all know what we're doing in overseas areas, because it's freely talked about. We have gotten most of our information when we do research using foreign articles and translating them. God bless Brave for creating that translation browser, because most of the information that I get that is the most damning comes from foreign sources,
Oh,
because they
absolutely.
talk about it freely.
No, because, well, and that's really, well, how do we not know what's going on? Well, it's Operation Mocking, it's the Mockingbird media.
Correct.
That's why, we basically call this, you've heard me talk about Gutenberg 2.0, which is what's going on with the internet. The powers that be over the last 150 years have regained their monopoly on the written, um, broadcast and the word, what the news agencies, what news everyone hears, they had the monopoly back. Well, they've lost that with the internet. That's why the biggest push right now is for the
Correct.
war on misinformation, because they need to get that control back. There's
Yep.
people like us that are speaking freely to people all over the world, and people all over the world can talk to us, and we can get the news from other countries. So we don't just have to rely on the Associated Press and Reuters to tell us what the truth is. And that's opened up the minds, and that's opened up the same conversations that with the first Gutenberg with the printing press, allowed people to speak freely for the first time, and that led to the Renaissance and the Reformation. This is the same opportunity. The free sharing of ideas among people around the world will set us free.
And that's the reason why TikTok has to go.
That's a whole show in of itself. Um, if they take, that TikTok bill is so bad, I mean, they could shut down Rumble tomorrow, you know, based on the exact same premise.
Correct.
Yeah,
And that's their intent.
yeah.
And it's not a coincidence that you have Michael Chernoff behind the disinformation campaign, who also was behind the Patriot Act. Come on.
No, there are no coincidences, my friend.
There are none.
All right, you mentioned the Russian sanctions, which, you would think that we'd have thought these things out a little bit. Here's an article from the Moscow Times. The major European banks are paying Russia more in taxes than before the Ukraine invasion. There's a reason that's happening. Russian banks are unable to participate in foreign exchange, but the sanctions have basically allowed all the European banks to come in there and greatly expand their lending activities in Russia. So this is when you say we're putting sanctions on Russia, but it's only partial because you're still allowing your own domestic corporations to go in there and do business and make billions of dollars. So that's the hypocrisy of our sanctions. Um, this report did not include U.S. banks like Citigroup or J.P. Morgan because they don't report their Russian results, but the American banks are in there as well. For example, Citigroup and the J.P. Morgan both paid. Well, Citigroup paid over 53 million in taxes in Russia, and it looks like J.P. Morgan was at 68 million in taxes. 6.8.
Well, and if you do the math on the percent of taxes, that means they're doing a crap load of business.
Yeah, they are, but we're sanctioning them. Although our banks are not. So
Correct.
the other fun one, if this transitions over here, the Western insurance companies say Russia oil price cap doesn't work. So it's basically they said Russia, you can only sell your price at I think it was $68 a barrel. Is that right? It's 60. The cap allows Western shippers and insurers to participate in Russian oil trading as long as the oil is sold below $60 a barrel. Well, what could possibly go wrong with this scheme?
Well, and again, I'd have to go back to who the hell are you? You are, you know what I mean? It's just so arrogant to me. You can starve the people in Russia because, of course, they call it a gas station. So in their theory, that's the only revenue that they have. And so you have to do it at basically rock bottom prices because we're mad at you.
Well, that's what's the problem is with what they call dollar diplomacy, and that really is we ought to finish on this topic because the United States has been the reserve currency for pretty much since Bretton Woods, post World War II. It has given us a gigantic advantage in both our own standard of living, but also our ability to flex geopolitical muscle
Correct.
through the World Bank, through these IMF loans. Uh, when you control the modern banking system and the exchange rate are done in dollars, people have to play by your rules. And it's what we call the Anglo-American transatlantic rules-based order.
And that was all set up after World War II. So we're right back where we started.
Yeah, it was just a handoff from the British to us. It really was. It's London's just as deeply involved in all of this stuff. I mean, the American CIA and the American corporations and NGOs may do the heavy lifting, but our partners across the pond are
Absolutely.
they've never let go of their favorite colony. And it's one of the examples I always like to use is, well, the United Nations supposed to be one representative per country, but the United States gets one vote there, and the members of the British Commonwealth get 54.
Correct.
Which is always a very interesting. Going back to the de-dollarization, which appears to be happening with the rise of the BRICS nations. And I don't say that it's a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a thing that is happening. It is good in the fact that I believe that currency competition keeps governments honest. If other countries have choices to get off the dollar, we can't use the dollar to bully them around. That's probably good for international peace.
Well, speaking of that, I just posted this morning on X about the WikiLeaks Hillary Clinton email about Gaddafi's gold dinar being the real reason why he had to go. So you're exactly right.
Yeah, we've been talking about that for a very long time. Why did we have to? We saw, he died. Why did that have to happen?
Because he was talking about getting off the dollar. Come
Yeah,
on.
absolutely. I'm trying to find one other screenshot I have for you. If I have it, I will share it. I do have it. Okay, excellent. So what happens if we do get off the US dollar? Or if they do, I'm sorry, not we get off the US dollar. If the dollar stops being the international reserve currency, well, you're going to see a drop in the standard of living in the United States. I pulled this one off yesterday, just ran into it. It's a nice graphic. What you see here is a bunch of countries, developed countries, and it basically takes their current account balance, which is imports minus exports or vice versa, as a percentage of the GDP. And if we go back to equilibrium on that with other developed nations that would show our average per capita income would drop about somewhere in a range of 27 to 57%. So that's how much of a boost America's standard of living has gotten from the dollar being the international reserve currency. This takes us back to the whole Russia rivalry between Russia and the US at this point in time. Russia's foreign policy has been clearly stated for more than 25 years in a document called the Primakov Doctrine. The
Yep.
Primakov Doctrine lays out Russia's geopolitical strategy, and the very first pillar was to get away from the dollar hegemony. They are
Yep.
accomplishing that as we speak, and it may not necessarily be a bad thing.
Well, it's a definitely good thing for them.
Yes, I mean, we've definitely not acted in Russia's best interest. The West has never done so.
And it's funny how all of this starts tying together. So you probably are aware that Zimbabwe just announced that it was going back to a gold standard. Were you
Uh,
aware of that?
no, I actually didn't see that announcement. No, I missed it.
All right, so that obviously, I'll take that as a to-do for our next SitRep, because you can imagine right? Because we know this template, we know what they're going to do. If you announce anything that's in your best interest and not in the West's best interest, you're going to be a target. So it'll be interesting to watch how that plays out and what has already been put in place in order to shield themselves against what they have to know will be the onslaught of activity. Also, what you were talking about, when you look at the big banks like Citibank, you then get into the Jamie Dimon, and there's a reason why Epstein was banking there. And all of this stuff starts circulating together. And you begin, when you are aware of all of it. And of course, didn't Russia seize JP Morgan's assets?
Yeah, they did some. Yeah, that just
See?
happened. That was like a week to 10 days ago.
Yeah. So all of this starts circulating together, and you can get a much clearer picture of what's going on.
What's really interesting is you touched on something important. Now we know what to look for. It's kind of easy to spot it in advance. That's why we brought up today Belarus and Georgia, because we know what to look for. It's happening right this minute.
Exactly.
What the, I would not be surprised for the next target to be Argentina, because they have a new president,
Oh,
a populist president that is basically going against globalist, uh, dogma. Yeah, there will be something in Argentina. I think that's too big of a target for them to pass up.
and it has been a safe haven for them since before World War II.
Yes.
They've owned Argentina.
Yeah, and that got it. Well, a populist president can get out of control, but and then
However, I will point this out. Prior to the new president, they had a massive raid on Operation Gladio forces there. So they may be safer than we think. There was a huge effort, just like they did in 2019 in Italy, when they took down the Denostris, however you say that, family. The entire largest mafia family was taken down in 2019. I don't think that was a coincidence to bringing in their new president. And I don't think the operations that preceded the current president that basically arrested a lot of the Gladio nodes was a coincidence either.
Yep, and the last coincidence, there's one other hotspot right now where they're doing a lot of student protests, and that is in Israel, in Tel Aviv. So Israel is we're not going to get into Israel today. That's a much longer topic, but that's place else where the same actors have absolutely got their boots on the ground and are whispering in ears. So Israel is going to be in the news quite a bit this year.
Yep.
Well, with that, let's give it a wrap. We're just over an hour, which is what we want to shoot for. Colonel, where can everyone find you?
I'm at Colonel Towner, spelt out, on X at Colonel Watkins, spelt out. In True Social, I have a Substack called The Colonel's Corner, and I'm also on Rumble at The Colonel's Corner.
And I'll put all the links in the description of this video on my channel, which you will find at war_hamster on Rumble. You can get me on Twitter. I can't say X yet. At war_hamster1776. And I am on True Social at war_hamster. And I should be launching both a live show in the next couple of weeks and also my own Substack. And that'll be coming very soon. Thanks, Colonel. I appreciate these are always a big hit with my audience, and I will shoot you over the recording when it's edited.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great doing this with you.
Always a pleasure. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, you too.